July 4th, 1187, the hills of Galilee. 15,000 men are dying of thirst. They're the finest knights of Christendom, Templars, Hospitallers, the entire military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They're 6 miles from the Sea of Galilee. They can see it. Some claim they can smell the water. But between them and survival stands Saladin's army and the smoke. Saladin has ordered his men to light brush fires in the dry scrubland, and now thick smoke rolls over the Christian camp, choking them, blinding them, adding to their torment. They've been without water for 24 hours. Some nights are so desperate they're drinking their horses' blood. A Muslim chronicler watching the scene would later write, "They were fearfully afflicted by thirst and had lost all morale. The infantry have broken ranks and are stumbling up the volcanic hills called the Horns of Hattin, hoping, praying for a spring, a well, anything. By sunset, this army will cease to exist. The true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, will be captured. Within 3 months, Jerusalem will fall, and 2 centuries of crusading will begin their irreversible collapse. One battle, one catastrophic decision, one afternoon that changed the Christian world." This is the story of Hattin, where religious fervor met military genius, and where pride met defiance, and in the end, collapse, where the Crusader dream of a Christian Holy Land died in the desert heat. Welcome back, I am Benito and this is the Eject Historian. Today we're talking about Saladin, Richard and the battle that broke the Crusades. To understand Hattin, we need to understand what was at stake in 1187 and how do we get to that point. Earlier in 1099, after 3 years of marching through hostile lands, starving in deserts and bleeding in battles they should have lost, the First Crusade achieved what seemed impossible. They captured Jerusalem. To the Christian world, this was nothing short of extraordinary, proof of God's favor. To the Islamic world, it was a shattering blow, a calamity that struck at the heart of their faith. Jerusalem held profound significance for Islam as its third holiest site, the place where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven on the night journey. Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock had stood as sacred Islamic monuments for centuries, but now a cross crowned the dome and European Christian lords governed the city. The Crusaders carved out 4 states in the Levant: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These were strange hybrid societies, European feudalism transplanted to the Middle East, ruling over Arab Christian and Muslim populations, adopting local customs while maintaining their identity as defenders of Christ. And for nearly 90 years, they survived. Not because they were strong, the Crusader states were always outnumbered, always short on manpower, always dependent on reinforcement from Europe. They survived because the Islamic world was fragmented. In the 12th century, the Middle East was a patchwork of rival powers that couldn't unite against their common enemy. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was Shia, wealthy and culturally sophisticated, but lacked military strength. The Seljuk Turks possessed power but remained hopelessly divided into competing Sunni emirates. Local Arab dynasties and Turkish warlords filled the remaining spaces, each carving out their own territory. The result was perpetual conflict, with everyone fighting everyone else. The Crusaders played them off each other brilliantly. They made alliances with Damascus against Egypt, with Egypt against Damascus. They built massive castles like Crac de Chevalier, Kerak, Beaufort, and virtually impregnable fortresses that controlled key routes and water sources. But this fragile balance depended on one thing: Muslim disunity. In the mid-12th century, that began to change. Then everything changed with the rise of one man, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. We know him as Saladin. He was born in Tilkrit in 1137 to a Kurdish family. His father served as a military commander under Nur ad-Din, the Turkish emir who'd been trying to unite Syria against the Crusaders. Young Saladin grew up in Damascus, trained in warfare and administration, and steadily rose through the ranks. In 1169, he joined a military expedition to Egypt and ended up becoming vizier, eventually prime minister of the Fatimid Caliphate. Within 2 years, the last Fatimid Caliphate was dead, and Saladin ruled Egypt in the name of the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved swiftly. He took Damascus, then Aleppo, then Mosul, city by city, treaty by treaty, battle by battle. He united Egypt, Syria, and much of Mesopotamia under one ruler for the first time since the Crusades began. And he had one goal: jihad. So the term encompassed both a spiritual struggle and military defense of Islam, but for Saladin it meant a sacred duty to reclaim Jerusalem and protect Muslim lands from foreign occupation. The Crusader states saw what was coming. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem was a brilliant ruler, yet he lived in tragic circumstances, dying slowly of leprosy. He held Saladin off through the 1170s and early 1180s, with clever diplomacy and a few desperate victories. But when Baldwin died in 1185, the throne passed to his sister Sibylla's husband, Guy de Lusignan. History has not been kind to Guy, and frankly, Guy didn't give history much to work with. He was the medieval equivalent of being promoted way beyond his competence. Brave, yes, pious, certainly, but possessing the strategic judgment of someone who'd confuse a map with a menu. His chief advisor made things worse, Reynald of Châtillon. He was a Crusader lord who spent 16 years rotting in a Muslim prison before being ransomed. He emerged with a burning hatred for Islam and absolutely no interest in treaties or diplomacy. He was in essence a medieval warlord who turned personal vendetta into foreign policy. Throughout 1186 and early 1187, Reynald repeatedly violated truces with Saladin. He raided Muslim caravans, he attacked pilgrim routes, then he went too far. He launched a fleet into the Red Sea to threaten Mecca itself. It was an act of such staggering provocation that he unified Muslim opinion against the Crusaders like nothing else could have. Saladin demanded that Guy hand over Reynald for justice. Guy refused. In late June 1187, Saladin crossed into Crusader territory with the largest army he'd ever assembled, somewhere between 30 to 40,000 troops. This was cavalry, infantry, and archers from Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia. This wasn't a raid. This was a full invasion. And Guy had to respond. The Crusaders gathered every available fighting man at Safuria, a town about 20 miles west of the Sea of Galilee. They assembled perhaps 15 to 20,000 troops, the entire military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The army included 1,200 heavy cavalry knights, several hundred Templar and Hospitaller warriors who formed the elite corps, Turcoples providing local light cavalry expertise, and thousands of infantry, crossbowmen, spearmen, and sergeants. They also brought their most sacred possession, the true cross, believed to be a fragment of the actual cross on which Christ was crucified. Having it on the battlefield was supposed to guarantee divine favor. The Crusaders gathered at Safuria, a fortified town in the hills of Galilee. This was smart positioning. The town had wells, defensive walls, and sat on the crossroads of major routes. From here, they could respond to virtually any threat. Saladin saw the trap and refused to walk into it. On July the 2nd, instead of attacking Safuria's strong defenses, he marched his army 20 miles east and laid siege to Tiberias, a fortress on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The choice was brilliant psychological warfare. Tiberias wasn't strategically vital. Saladin could take it or leave it, but it belonged to Raymond of Tripoli, one of the most powerful Crusader nobles. And Raymond's wife, Esquiva, was trapped inside with only a small garrison. Saladin was baiting a trap, and he knew exactly what he was doing. The Crusaders would feel honor-bound to rescue a nobleman's wife. They couldn't abandon her without looking cowardly. But marching from Safuria to Tiberias in July meant crossing 20 miles of exposed, waterless terrain under the brutal summer sun. Either way, the Crusaders chose. Saladin won. The Crusader leaders gathered for a war council. Raymond of Tripoli had the most experience of any man present. Decades fighting in the Levant, years spent as Saladin's captive, almost a decade, intimate knowledge of both the terrain and their enemy's mind. He stood before them and begged them not to march. According to the chronicler Ernul, Raymond warned, "My lords, if we go meet Saladin, we shall be delivering ourselves into his hands. The march is long and there is no water. We shall all perish of thirst before we engage the enemy. Let my city fall. I would rather lose Tiberias than see the kingdom destroyed." Raymond was willing to sacrifice his own fortress and possibly his own wife to preserve the kingdom's military strength. But Reynald of Châtillon called him a coward. Gerard IV, the master of the Templars, joined in pressuring Guy to march. He had his own grudge against Raymond and saw an opportunity to undermine him. The other nobles, stung by the implication of cowardice, demanded action. Guy, weak and indecisive, overruled Raymond. On the morning of July 3rd, 1187, the Crusader army left Safuria and marched east toward Tiberias. It was a death march from the start. The temperature climbed from over 40 degrees Celsius, well over 100 Fahrenheit. The knights wore chainmail hauberks with padding underneath and surcoats on top, plus helmets that trapped the heat. The infantry carried shields, weapons, supplies. There was no shade anywhere. No water except what they brought with them. Within hours, Saladin's light cavalry appeared on the horizon. These mounted archers, Turks, Kurds, Bedouins rode fast, agile horses and employed devastating harassment tactics. They'll gallop within range, lose their arrows, then wheel away before the Crusader knights could close the distance. It was brutally effective. The heavy cavalry, weighted down by armor, couldn't catch them. The infantry had to march in tight formation with shields raised, unable to strike back, just enduring the constant rain of arrows. And the whole time, the heat was unbearable. Thirst was becoming desperate, and blood soaked through their padding. By afternoon, men were collapsing from heat exhaustion, and horses were dropping dead in their traces. The column stretched out dangerously, becoming increasingly vulnerable. Guy finally ordered a halt near the village of Hattin, at the base of two volcanic hills shaped like horns, the Horns of Hattin. They were 6 miles from the Sea of Galilee, 6 miles from water. The plan was to rest overnight and push through to Tiberias at first light, but they already lost the initiative. During the night, Saladin's army already encircled the camp, cutting off any hope of escape. Then Saladin gave the order that would seal the Crusaders' fate: set fire to the dry scrubland surrounding them. The dry grass and brush ignited. Ibn al-Athir, the Muslim chronicler, wrote, Saladin ordered all his men to collect brushwood, dry grass, and anything that would burn. They set fire to it, and the wind carried the heat and smoke towards the enemy. They suffered terribly from this, in addition to their raging thirst. Men choked on the acrid smoke, eyes streaming and burning. No one could sleep. The psychological torment matched the physical agony. They were trapped, surrounded, parched with thirst, choking on smoke, and could do nothing but wait helplessly for dawn. The day came, July 4th, 1187. The Crusader army was already defeated. They just did not know it yet. The infantry broke first. The foot soldiers would suffer most during the march. They stumbled up the slopes of the Horns of Hattin in desperate hope of finding water, relief, anything. Muslim archers positioned on the slopes shot them down as they climbed, while others, seeing the futility, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Within the first hour, thousands of infantry were dead or captured. Now the Crusader cavalry, the knights and military orders tried to break through Saladin's line toward the Sea of Galilee. If they could reach water, they might still survive. Raymond of Tripoli formed up his heavy cavalry and led the charge toward the Muslim center, his knights advancing at full gallop in tight formation. Saladin's line opened to let them through, a calculated tactical decision. The Muslim commanders allowed Raymond's force to punch through their lines, then closed ranks behind them, cutting them off from the rest of the Crusader army. Raymond and his knights kept riding, whether driven by desperation, shame, or cold pragmatism, we'll never know. They escaped. Everyone else was now trapped. Guy and the main force, perhaps 1,000 knights plus the Templar and Hospitaller orders, found themselves completely surrounded. They charged repeatedly, desperately trying to break through Saladin's line. Each time, the Muslim cavalry would part, absorb the charge, then close around them, and again like a noose tightening. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Horses collapsed from thirst or fell to arrows, forcing the Crusaders to fight on foot. Knights began discarding their shields. The weight had become unbearable. Some, driven mad by thirst, resorted to drinking their horses' blood. In desperation, Guy ordered the true cross erected on the Horns of Hattin as a rallying point, a symbol that God still protected them. The Bishop of Acre raised it high above the chaos. Minutes later, Muslim cavalry overran the position and seized it. A Muslim witness wrote, "The taking of this cross was more important to them than the capture of the king. It was the supreme calamity." The psychological impact was devastating. The true cross, the holiest relic in the kingdom, their guarantee of God's favor, was now in enemies' hands. If God wouldn't protect his own cross, what hope did any of them have? What followed was less a battle than a slaughter. Knights began surrendering in groups, throwing down their weapons. Only the Templars and Hospitallers, the military orders who sworn sacred oaths never to retreat, fought to the bitter end. They were cut down where they stood or dragged away in chains. By midday, it was over. King Guy de Lusignan was dragged before Saladin's tent, parched and defeated. Saladin offered him a cup of water. In Islamic custom, offering food or drink to a prisoner grants them mercy and protection from execution. Guy drank gratefully, then offered the cup to Reynald of Châtillon. Saladin stopped him. "You offered him the water, not me." He turned to Reynald and reminded him of every broken treaty, every murdered Muslim pilgrim, every raid on defenseless caravans. According to Ibn al-Artir, Saladin said, "I myself will avenge Muhammad upon you." Reynald remained defiant to the very end. Saladin drew his sword and struck the first blow himself. His guards finished the execution. Then Saladin turns to the other prisoners and made a chilling decision. He ordered the execution of every captured Templar and Hospitaller. about 230 men in total. These were religious warriors who'd sworn sacred oaths to fight Islam to the death, and in Saladin's calculation they were too dangerous to ransom or release. They had to die. The rest of the captured army, thousands of common soldiers, were sold into slavery or held for ransom depending on their worth. The true cross was sent to Damascus as a trophy, paraded through the streets upside down in deliberate humiliation. After that, it vanished from history. No one knows what became of Christianity's holiest relic. The Kingdom of Jerusalem's army had ceased to exist. After Hattin, the Crusader states collapsed like a house of cards. Within days, Saladin's armies were besieging Acre, the kingdom's main port. It fell on July 10th, just 6 days after Hattin. Then came Jassa, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon. One by one, the coastal cities surrendered. Without armies to defend them, they had no choice. By September, Saladin stood at the walls of Jerusalem. The city had overflowed with refugees, Christians fleeing the countryside, families of captured or slain soldiers, clergy who'd abandoned their churches. But there was almost no military force left. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, a cleric named Heraclius, tried to organize a defense with perhaps a few hundred knights and a makeshift militia of civilians. This was not enough, of course. Saladin offered straightforward terms: surrender peacefully and everyone could leave safely, resist and the city would be sacked. The Christians tried to negotiate. They made two arguments. First, thousands of Muslim civilians lived inside Jerusalem and would die in an assault. Second, if Saladin attacked, the defenders would destroy the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque before they fell. They were holding Islam's third holiest site hostage. Saladin agreed to terms. He set a ransom, 10 dinars for each man, 5 for each woman, 1 for each child. Anyone who could pay would walk free. Anyone who couldn't would be sold into slavery. On October 2nd, 1187, 88 years to the day after Crusaders had stormed the city, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin. The contrast with 1099 was stark. When the Crusaders took Jerusalem, they massacred most of the Muslim and Jewish population. A Crusader chronicler wrote without shame, "In the Temple of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins." It was one of the worst atrocities of the medieval period. Saladin allowed peaceful evacuation. He even paid ransoms for some of the poor from his own treasury. Christian churches were mostly left intact, though the Dome of the Rock was ritually cleansed and rededicated as a mosque. This act of mercy became legendary. It made Saladin a hero in the Islamic world and ironically earned him grudging respect in Christian Europe. Even Crusader chroniclers named him chivalrous and noble. But mercy doesn't change strategic reality. Jerusalem was lost. The Crusader states had been reduced to a handful of coastal fortresses. The dream of a permanent Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was dying. News of Hattin and Jerusalem's fall reached Europe in late 1187, triggering shock, grief, and fury across Christendom. Pope Urban III reportedly died of a heart attack when he received the news. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately called for a new crusade, what would become the Third Crusade. The response was unprecedented. 3 of Europe's most powerful kings took the cross: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II Augustus of France, and Richard I of England. Of the 3, Richard would become legend. Richard the Lionheart, one of the most famous kings in English history, though he spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England. Born in 1157, Richard was the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He grew up expecting to inherit only Aquitaine from his mother, But when his older brothers died or rebelled, he became heir to the English throne. Richard saw the Crusades as the ultimate test of knightly virtue, the chance to prove himself on history's greatest stage. When Richard became king in 1189, he immediately began raising money for the crusade, selling titles, lands, offices, anything that could be converted to cash. He reportedly said, "I would sell London if I could find a buyer." In 1190, he set sail for the Holy Land. Frederick Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia in 1190, never reaching the Holy Land. Philip Augustus of France made it to Acre but departed in 1191 after the city's capture, officially citing illness but really driven by his bitter rivalry with Richard. Richard reached the Holy Land in June 1191 and immediately seized control of the campaign. He captured Acre, ending a 2-year siege that had become a bloody stalemate. He pushed down the coast toward Jaffa, smashing Saladin's army at Arsuf. He reinforced the coastal cities and brokered alliances with local Christian nobles and pragmatic Muslim princes. 3 times he prepared to march on Jerusalem. The nature of the war shifted. After Arsuf, Richard and Saladin avoided direct confrontation. No more epic field battles. Instead, they played a strategic game of chess with armies. Richard's plan was linear: secure the coast, maintain European supply routes, advance inland with overwhelming logistics. Saladin's plan was patient: deny Richard the decisive battle where his tactical genius mattered, destroy resources along any approach to Jerusalem, and let exhaustion and time wear down the Crusaders. As Alessandro Barbero observes about medieval warfare, understanding when not to fight was often the mark of the greatest commanders. Saladin had learned this lesson from years of campaigning, and he knew Richard couldn't stay forever. European kings had kingdoms to govern. Crusaders had estates back home, generating their wealth. Time ultimately favored the defender. Richard made 2 serious attempts to march on Jerusalem, once in 1191 and again in mid-1192. Both times he advanced to within sight of the city's walls. Both times his military advisors convinced him to turn back. The reason came down to cold logistics. Even if Richard captured Jerusalem, he couldn't hold it. The city sat inland, far from the coast, surrounded by Muslim territory on all sides. His supply lines would be stretched impossibly thin and vulnerable to attack. Saladin would simply besiege the city, cut off supplies, and wait. Richard would be trapped, repeating Guy de Lusignan's catastrophic error in reverse. Richard made the hardest decision a commander can make. He withdrew. A famous legend, probably an apocryphal, claims that when Richard came within sight of Jerusalem but chose to turn back, he covered his eyes with his shield because he couldn't bear to look at the cities he failed to capture. The Old French continuation of William of Tyre records him saying, "Those who are not worthy to conquer the holy city are not worthy to look upon it." In September 1192, Richard and Saladin signed a 3-year truce. The Crusaders would keep the coastal cities from Tyre south to Jaffa. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims could visit the holy sites safely and without harassment. Richard sailed for home in October 1192. His journey became its own disaster. Shipwrecked off the coast, he was captured by the Duke of Austria, an old enemy, and held for ransom for over a year. After securing his release, he spent the rest of his life waging wars in France. In 1199, he died from an infected crossbow wound sustained while besieging a minor castle in a petty property dispute. He never returned to the Holy Land. Saladin, exhausted by years of constant warfare and failing health, died in Damascus in March 1193, just months after signing the treaty with Richard. So, what did Hattin actually change? Militarily, it destroyed the Crusader state's ability to wage offensive war. Before Hattin, the Kingdom of Jerusalem could field armies of 10 to 15,000 men and strike deep into Muslim territory. After Hattin, they were reduced to defending coastal fortresses and hoping for reinforcements from Europe. Psychologically, it shattered the myth of Crusader invincibility. For 80 years, the Crusader states had survived against overwhelming odds. Hattin proved they were vulnerable, that everything could collapse in a single afternoon. As historian Thomas Asbridge notes, Hattin was not simply a military defeat, it was a catastrophe of such magnitude that it shattered the Latin East's capacity to defend itself. Medieval historian Alessandro Barbero emphasizes how battles like Hattin revealed the crucial interplay between leadership, logistics, and morale. Guy's fatal march became a textbook example of how ignoring terrain and supply lines could doom even the most heavily armed force, regardless of valor or divine favor. Strategically, Hattin shifted the balance of power permanently. Jerusalem never returned to Christian rule. The Third Crusade recaptured some territory, but it remained defensive, not expansionist. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 didn't even reach the Holy Land. It sacked Constantinople instead, fatally weakening the Byzantine Empire. Hattin's impact reached even further. 73 years later, when the Mongols invaded and destroyed Baghdad in 1258, it was the Mamluks, successors to Saladin's unified Islamic State, who stopped them at Ain Jalut in 1260. Without the foundation Saladin built at Hattin, the Islamic heartlands might not have survived the Mongol apocalypse. The Crusader states themselves lingered for another few decades after Hattin, but they were shadows of their former selves. The last Crusader fortress, Acre, fell to those same Mamluks in 1291, ending 2 centuries of Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land. But what if the Crusaders had won at Hattin? If Guy de Lusignan had listened to Raymond of Tripoli and stayed at Safuria, Saladin would have eventually had to lift the siege of Tiberias and withdraw. The Crusader armies would have survived and Jerusalem would have stayed Christian. More importantly, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would have remained viable. With Europe sending periodic reinforcements and coastal cities generating trade revenue, the Crusader states might have lasted for centuries, not as conquerors, but as permanent hybrid Christian-Arab civilization in the Levant. We may have seen a distinct Eastern Christian culture emerge, European feudalism mixed with Arab science, Byzantine architecture and Mediterranean trade networks, a bridge between East and West. And Saladin? If it lost at Hattin, his unity project might have collapsed. The Ayyubid dynasty might have fragmented immediately. The Islamic Middle East might have stayed divided for generations. But Guy marched into the desert and history pivoted. Without Saladin's victory at Hattin, there is no unified Islamic state capable of resisting the Mongols in 1260. And Jalut might have never happened, and the Mongols might have taken Egypt, North Africa, and perhaps even pushed into Europe. Hattin was the hinge. It closed the door on the Crusader dream and opened the door to Islamic resurgence. Everything else follows from that. In closing, at the Horns of Hattin, on a scorching July afternoon in 1187, one decision doomed an army, a kingdom, and a 200-year dream. Guy de Lusignan thought he was being brave. He thought God would protect them. He thought the true cross guaranteed victory. Saladin knew better. He understood terrain, logistics, and human psychology. He understood that thirst and heat kill as surely as swords, and he understood that sometimes you don't need to fight. You just need to wait for your enemy to destroy himself. Hattin was a masterclass in how not to fight a battle. Don't march your army through a desert in summer. Don't let yourself be baited into bad terrain. Don't ignore your experienced commanders because you're afraid of looking weak. But Hattin was also a masterclass in how wars are really won, through unity, patience, and understanding your enemy's weaknesses. Richard the Lionheart understood this, which is why he and Saladin fought to a draw. Richard knew he couldn't hold Jerusalem even if he took it, so he didn't try. Saladin knew he couldn't defeat Richard in open battle, so he didn't commit. Two brilliant commanders stalemated by strategic reality. And in the end, Saladin achieved what he'd set out to do. He reclaimed Jerusalem, he broke the Crusader offensive capability, Richard went home and the Crusader states withered, and Islam controlled the Holy Land for the next 8 centuries. Saladin died just months after the treaty, but his legacy endured. One battle changed everything. Next time, we're jumping forward to a siege that ended an empire and changed the world. Gunpowder, cannons, and the fall of the city that has stood for 1,000 years. We will be in Constantinople, 1453, the end of Rome itself. I will see you on the battlefield.